Hello, my name is Steve Lozier. I'm an education specialist in the Metropolitan School District of Wayne Township. I am focused on inquiry and engagement, and specifically focused on helping teachers plan and implement project-based learning units in our schools. This module is one of many designed to help teachers better understand project-based learning and design and develop PBL units to engage and challenge their students. This presentation is available to you by following the link in the My Big Campus bundle, as well as the Google folder associated with it. And I would suggest that you open the presentation in another tab, as you may want to pause this video, click on a link or a resource in the presentation to explore further. And please note that if you are new to PBL and just building your knowledge, this video would be considered the third in the sequence. So our objectives today is I hope that you'll be able to find relevance in your curriculum or find your curriculum in the world around you in order to develop a unit idea for a PBL unit. And I hope that you'll begin with the end in mind by considering what students should know and be able to do at the end of the unit. So those content, knowledge, skills, experiences, and then generate some ideas about possible products and presentations to culminate the unit. So just to frame this in our work in Wayne, as I'm sure you're aware, Wayne teachers have either developed or continue to refine and develop district units of study for each of the content areas or grade levels. So just to refresh your memory, these units must be taught to a mastery level, not just proficiency. They are our guaranteed and viable curriculum. It's our core that we believe all students must have to move on to the next level and be successful. Common assessments in these units are used to inform instruction in the data team process, but are not written to assess beyond proficiency. And as many of the ELA teachers in the district have learned as they've implemented these units, the common assessments are just one tool, and they are often other rigorous tasks and assessments must be developed in addition to those unit resources. So remember, in order to allow you, the teacher, to be responsive to your students and ensure your professional autonomy, the units are the what and the why of our curriculum, but they're never the how. You're the professional that must make those instructional decisions about how to teach your students and get each one of them to mastery. And PBL is particularly powerful or relevant to the units of study because of how PBL can engage students or use inquiry to propel those students to mastery, while also allowing for flexibility and student-centered instruction that provides multiple paths and strategies for students to get there. So these are just to review some of our unit best practices in Wayne. We begin with the end in mind. So what do you expect your students to know and be able to do at the end of the unit? What does transfer look like, both in terms of a product and presentation and also in terms of a traditional standardized assessment? Kids need to be able to transfer learning across contexts, and we have to focus on both of those. Scaffolding, so the gradual release of responsibility. So how will you move students to independence with the content and skills, and also give them some ownership of their learning? They're aligned with priority standards, so this helps us to simplify, clarify, and remain focused on what we want students to master. And they're aligned with student readiness and need. So the nice thing about PBL is you can determine the most engaging or relevant access point to the content based on your students. You know how they're wired, how they may engage with something, so PBL allows you to take those units and really meet your students with where they're going to get engaged with it and then leverage that engagement for learning. There are also clear learning targets that are rigorous, instructionally responsive with intentionality, and then efficient, effective, and diverse use of instructional strategies. So those all fit into best practices in a unit, and they're extremely essential in PBL. So getting back to the purpose of this this module is to how to develop a unit idea. So there's a couple different ways to do that. One, and the way recommended by organizations like BIE, which is a national PBL group, is to start with the standards, start with the curriculum. So I have some science standards from 7th grade here. These are Indiana State standards that I've pulled from, and you can just kind of give you a chance to read through these standards to familiarize yourself with them for a minute. So getting back to PBL as kind of being that access point to the curriculum, this is some very heavy teacher talk, or some teacher words. These standards aren't student friendly yet, and we'd have to work to do that. But if you look for the relevance in the standards, I've highlighted there earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. So when I look at these standards and I see some of these dense skills and knowledge that students need from these standards, I hone in on where is the relevancy in those standards. So I see something there. So I start to generate ideas like, could an earthquake or volcano destroy Indiana? Could it destroy Indianapolis or our city? Questions like, should we take preventative measures against earthquakes or volcanoes in Indiana? Should we be concerned with those sort of things? And we'll develop driving questions like that in another module. But by asking bigger questions like that based on the big ideas, we get to essential questions based into the need to know. So where students are asking questions from that, like how is the earth structured? When you look at that first standard, when we ask that question, then that creates the need to know that standard. How does the internal structure of the earth change and move? So you ask that question and have students ask that question, and again, that standard comes alive and becomes relevant. Does the Earth's magnetic field play any role? Would bring in the question in that standard too about the magnetic field. So you start to see how we have students ask those questions by engaging with the problem or challenge in order to learn the content. And just continuing on here with some other standards that are kind of relevant to this unit, I thought if we kind of unpack these standards and put them in a question form for students, we would ask things like, are certain layers of rock more volatile than others? Has Indiana changed in the past in terms of geological features? Have the changes been positive or negative? You could look at destruction at the time being a negative, but have they benefited in the long term in terms of development, things like that? Get at some bigger concepts of change that would really be here that students could really hone in on and explore. So that's an example, just real quick, about how you can look at the curriculum for relevancy and start to get a unit idea. And if I continue that same idea, maybe instead of starting with that curriculum as a science teacher, maybe you would read an article like this. And I know this is a little dated, and that's one thing I'll note. Project-based learning units have a shelf life in terms of their relevancy, but it is possible for earthquakes to happen in Indiana, and here's one example. So you could start with just hearing this article yourself or reading about it, and then you could use that with your students to engage them back with the content in the curriculum. So we could use this article. This would also provide a nice entry event, which we'll talk about in a different module. You could also think about who deals with this problem, who gets up every morning and who's concerned with the problem or challenge of earthquakes in Indiana. And this is a Indiana University group where there's a vast amount of information here that you could use. And this just continues that. But this is also their profile, a little bit more of a academic view on the event that happened in 2011 with an earthquake, but this would give you some resources and would also be a possible partnership, which is another topic of another module. So you could start with the curriculum, with the standards, and then find the relevancy in your local community, state, the nation, the world, or you could start with an event you hear about. And one of the things as you get proficient with PBL is you suddenly cannot turn off where you find relevancy and how you get excited about how you could engage kids with something you hear on the radio, something you see on the news, something you read about, that sort of thing. So where to start? So I would say you can go to the standards or look around you just to review that. And these are some examples here. If you have access to a BIE resource called the PBL Starter Kit, there's some page numbers there that take you through that process. There's a couple other resources out there that help you with that. I've included a slide here. This may be where you want to pause the presentation and actually click on some of these resources where they're hyperlinked, but these are just some internet resources where current relevant topics and issues are to find some things either specifically about PBL or about just some relevant real-world problems or challenges that you could then tie back to your curriculum. One final piece of this is to think interdisciplinary. And so think about how you could bring in other disciplines in your school to engage students and increase the rigor. Just to kind of give you a concept map, I would even suggest pausing this right now and just drawing something up like this as you've kind of thought about some ideas today, and develop those either from those resources or just as you're thinking through. Think about how the other content areas can factor in here, and I know I haven't listed them all. But just as an example, if we continue with the earthquake example, students could use ELA skills to write proposals or an argument piece to stakeholders on the issue. They could use math skills rooted in like the topography of the land if it was geometry. They could calculate probability of earthquakes, things like that. They could budget for their solution. So you want to look at what the grade level is and what the math content and standards would be and how those could connect. In social studies, they could study the history of an earthquake specifically or project into a what-if scenario, which would be a little more problem-based, but that'd still be effective, about the short and long-term effects of an earthquake in their community, in their state, and society, those sort of things. What can we learn from other places this has happened, either in earthquakes or just natural disasters? And this is where your colleagues are so important. I would not force an interdisciplinary connection. I'd ask yourself, does bringing in another discipline's content and skills increase the rigor? Does it make it more relevant and engaging? And then does it do both of those things? And if there's any question there as to how well it does that, I would consider, it might not be worth the class time or the energy to make those connections. I think you can make those connections anywhere, though, as well. And again, your needs of your students, certain students might really be a math-wired kid that would get into something like that. So that really helps. I would also ask myself, can I deliver this content or address this need? So if I'm thinking about outside of my expertise, can I still provide that? Will I need support from another teacher or an outside partner to either build my knowledge and deliver that content, or could I use another teacher or outside partner to plan, to even deliver that instruction and to assess? And we'll look at how to leverage partnerships and things like that a little later, but just some things to think about here. I'll give you the opportunity. It's a lot of talking. You could stop here and develop your idea if you haven't done so already. As we've looked at this, these next slides are specific content area or subject area issues with generating a unit idea. So each content has a different perspective, I think, on how we do this, and I just wanted to explore each of those a little bit. So if we're going to talk about math, one of the things we first need to talk about is project-based learning versus problem-based learning. So problem-based learning is going to be more of a scenario. It's not going to be the actionable change level of solving a problem or solution and carrying that through. But problem-based can be very effective. What's nice is you can scale down an inquiry event to a smaller chunk of time with smaller skills. It's not as complex, that sort of thing. So just some suggestions. I would look at the work of Dan Meyer. He's all about making math engaging and relevant and rigorous, and so there's some examples there if you want to click there. There are also some problem-based learnings here. If you click there, from Jeff Kroll. He's a New Tech, which is a PBL modeled school design. He's an instructional coach there, and his blog's really good with some ideas. And it's really interesting that math is often made more relevant by connections to another content in another unit. And I kind of explored those already, but thinking about budgets, geometry, the mathematical practices really drive to a conceptual place that overlap greatly with ELA. If you haven't looked at those, that's a great source as well. In terms of ELA, it's often made more relevant by connections to another content. So there's always speaking and listening skills in presentations, regardless of what you're presenting on. Written products are always very relevant to any unit. And then the reading skills needed in the inquiry and research stages of the unit are essential regardless of the content. So you can always bring ELA skills into a unit, I would argue. There are research geared units in ELA that really fit well here. And then there's also the relevance through the text. So If we went back to the earthquake unit that I used, students could read some like post-apocalyptic literature that raised this concern prior to or during this unit. So they could engage with the problem or challenge through a text, or they could read it in tandem as they think about this problem. And just as a shout out, there's a local Indiana author, Mike Mullen, whose wife happens to work in the school district, who's written a book called Ashfall that's based on the hypothetical eruption of a volcano under one of the national parks. So that's just an example of that connection. Social studies, so students can access a problem or challenge through the moment in history or use that historical moment and are learning from it to address a current problem or challenge. Or they can do a kind of hybrid by evaluating causes and effects of historical events that we know now and play with those causes and effects to shift them or change the outcomes. That's going to be more of a problem-based scenario, but it's still effective. Another powerful approach that can bring in some interdisciplinary connections to English language arts is to have your students then rewrite that history or consider who wrote the historical account, offer counter narratives or perspectives on that writing, so that's writing with a W, or writing with an R, history's wrongs, if you will, and understanding that it is highly subjective has been a powerful, big conceptual piece to history and social studies. Geography can be challenging to find relevance to engage students as the content's pretty big in scope and the curriculum's not always geared towards higher level application or the use of that content. However, teachers have found success by using a problem or challenge in a specific geographical region or location that place faces and connecting that problem to the geography. Successful units have been used for things like health issues, educational issues, economic issues, as well as war and conflict to build relevance into the geography. And so how does geography impact the society and the people there? Sociology and psychology are ample sources of relevance in that students can often easily connect with them and those around them. Economics was actually where PBL was born in K-12 education, at least in terms of being problem-based, as teachers used economic challenges and scenarios to ask students to apply and use economic thinking and concepts to specific contexts. You can still find those old units on BIE's website. Government always has the power of relevancy in that our democratic society can always be challenged, changed, and criticized. So there's always that question of how well does our government function and work with specific problems or challenges and what can be done about those. So the challenge social studies often faces is the coverage question, or of often addressing a massive amount of content. So teachers feel as though they have little time for in-depth critical thinking sometimes because of all the standards, all the content-specific standards, those sort of things. So I hope you can easily see the connection to the earthquake example and that students could take a historical perspective on earthquakes, definitely look at them in terms of geography and consider the sociological or psychological impact of a natural disaster on humans, as well as economic impact and also government interventions in those events. I hope you can also understand how teachers must be very intentional and strategic in planning to keep the scope of learning in check, but always acknowledge students may take the learning in these directions. Teachers as facilitators must know how to diplomatically manage students relative to the learning targets and keep everyone engaged and moving. So foreign language, it can be challenging due to the lower level language skills of students and the higher level relevant context when students in our system in the United States are often engaging with the foreign language in middle and high school. The problems and challenges for middle and high school students that engage them sometimes would require much more complex language. So that's just something to think through. Sometimes students will just increase the rigor of that language themselves in order to perform at that level. We've seen evidence of that. But teachers must also ensure proper transfer of the language, not get distracted that kids may be able to use these higher level vocabulary and language constructions in a presentation piece, but there's also the core curriculum that we have to keep in mind. One effective piece here has been the use of elementary age students as partners or authentic audiences. So teaching is one of the most powerful learning tools we have, and so delivering that content to students has helped. So relevant unit ideas used within this township have looked at the problems and challenges individuals or groups face when communication is a challenge due to language barriers and really tried to address those issues. And I'll just note, I was part of the foreign language textbook adoption, and the text for the Spanish teachers chose immerse students in a problem-based scenario using characters to engage with the language through an amazing race type experience. And each chapter had students taking on the roles of these characters to use the language by addressing language and cultural challenges. These teachers thought that this was particularly powerful because it allowed students to develop and use culturally specific Spanish from all over the globe, practicing the nuances and cultural mores rather than just the traditional Spanish from Spain. So it looks like foreign language is maybe headed in this direction as we see the power of it for kids to transfer and use language. So like foreign language, EL, English learners can be challenging due to the language ability. But it does benefit from being a hot topic, I believe, in our state and our society. And so what are the problems and challenges that come from a non-native speaker, or the problems and challenges posed to a largely English-speaking populace in an ever-changing cultural and language-changing context. So this can be really engaging. This any of the topics, excuse me, there are relevant to all kind of students and stakeholders. So performing arts has the benefit that it often results in a performance which serves as the product or presentation of learning. But with these performance expectations and subsequent deadlines, so the idea that a play is going to happen here, a choir performance, a band competition is going to happen on this date, sometimes the teacher can be the one driving the learning and not the students, and taking over some of the critical thinking, the 21st century skill pieces in that. There's also sometimes limited student voice and choice when there's a performance standard. So when how students are being evaluated in that performance is a certain caliber and really drives students towards one solution or one answer to a problem or challenge, they're not able to truly critically think as much about that. So performing art teachers who've provided students more ownership and voice and choice in the township have also raved about the student learning, but they've also pointed out that performance judges are looking at the end product, not the growth of the learning all the time, and therefore the end product can sometimes carry more weight than the student growth and the student learning. So that's just a point of tension, I think, as they think through that. So art has also the benefit that it's product driven. There's connections everywhere to 21st century skills in terms of a piece, communicating, providing, using creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking. But we can see the creativity and communication are really relevant. Collaboration could be a struggle, but if you think of it literally or figuratively, you can provide moments where artists have conversations about their piece in the process and use that feedback and that sort of thing to structure it within the classroom. They can also collaborate with real artists. Art teachers are often very talented artists themselves that feed into that. Critical thinking, so using artist statements, and here's an interdisciplinary connection to language arts, or reflections over a piece, become taught and assessed experiences with that. So consider the larger art audience beyond just the classroom and the teacher here, and then challenge students to consider how their art can serve their community or our society, etc. Career Center is just full of relevancy, so current problems or challenges from the profession or industry can constantly come into the instruction. They can run the risk of, with some dual credit and certification experiences, being very product focused or end result focused. But there's always moments to bring in some relevancy to that. So there's constant stream of news in terms of that. There's partnerships already in place too, I'm sure you know, with advisory boards. So consider having these individuals bring problems or challenges to students. Consider having these individuals provide feedbacks to students during or after the unit. So business is also highly, highly relevant. Few other content areas directly address relevant, authentic problems and challenges like business, but it can also be problem-based using business scenarios rather than authentic context, and you need to think about what you want to leverage there. Consider how units could actually be networking opportunities for students to directly work with and interact with local business community, and think about how that's a very powerful piece and a big contributor to success further on. And the 21st century skills there are also huge in the business community that they're essential for student success there. So Health and PE, they're always in the news. There's always examples. You know, I think every newscast has something to do with health, and how, obviously, how physical education fits in there. With PE, it can be challenging to give kids 21st century experiences in the classroom, but I've seen some really creative things done throughout the township to do that. So there's also always the coverage content issue with health and PE. Finally, special services. They often bring the differentiation lens to everything and how different paths to learning for each student is necessary, so they really get that student-centered idea of PBL. It's often a nice instructional approach in terms of engaging students with special needs. However, sometimes providing too much choice or too little structure challenges these students and can negatively impact their learning process. So I just caution there. Also, we must be extremely cautious not to lower the level of expectation or rigor for the sake of engagement and reduce PBL to that light or fluffy status that we talked about at the beginning. So those are specifics, just some insights that I have from my work with teachers in all these content areas over the years. Final part of this is if you're using the PBL planning form, the district form, this would be that box A where you would kind of capture your project idea, and you'll see that we're going to move from that into crafting a driving question or challenge and how that fits. You could also fill in content skills and standards in box C if you explored those in developing your idea, to put those there. And that's that. So thanks for your time.